everybody, and welcome to JTV. So we're recording this a day before Yom Hashoah, the Holocaust Memorial Day in Israel. And we're joined today by a personal friend, Rabbi, and friend of JTV, Ken Spiro, who is an author, historian, rabbi. Most notably, he wrote a crash course in Jewish history, which you can get on Amazon and online, as well as a few other fascinating books about Jewish history. Rabbi Ken Spiro, thank you so much for joining us via online link from New York. So I want to just jump right into talking about anti-Semitism generally, and also we'll talk about the Holocaust specifically. I try to make JTV a positive and uplifting channel, and there's so much to Judaism beyond the challenges and persecution we've suffered, even though, of course, I think we need to talk about them. But at the same time, there's such a, anti-Semitism isn't just tragic and painful as it is. And, I remember when I went to visit Poland, I was in such a somber state afterwards for a very long time. Just the reality of the Shoah, of the Holocaust, became so much more clear and present to me. We kind of learn about it in schools and read it in textbooks, but when you're actually there, it's like, oh my God, this really happened. And it's so recent, 75 years ago. My grandparents were alive when, I think about the film The Wizard of Oz was filmed in the 30s, something that we relate to as kids and watch growing up, or Snow White, that was before the Holocaust. So that we think it's some ancient civilizational past where it occurred. It's recent. But as well as it being, what I wanted to say was, as well as it being tragic, it's also fascinating and mysterious, anti-Semitism. And I want to first hear from you what it is that makes it fascinating and unique, a unique kind of hatred in world history. And would you agree that, as someone that studied not only history but other historians, most objective historians, anyone that looks at Jewish history objectively, takes a look at anti-Semitism and is baffled and perplexed?
Right. Well, first of all, thanks for having me on your show. Absolutely. Jewish history, the ups and the downs, the highs and the lows are all kind of supernatural. There's a great line from David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister of Israel, who was very far from being an observant Jew, but he said, to be a realist as a Jew, you have to believe in miracles. And the problem, I always say, the problem with looking at Jewish history in general is when you're in it as a Jew, if supernatural happens to you every day, it just becomes natural and normal. But you're right, if you stand back objectively, look at Jewish history and compare it to, other people's histories, you see there's really, the highs and the lows are very different from anyone else. We are like the exception in history that proves the rule. And you started asking that question about, what makes anti-Semitism unique. We don't have a monopoly on hatred and racism and oppression. There's, unfortunately, that's a eternal feature of all of human history, of one group oppressing another. But there are aspects of anti-Semitism that just set it apart from any other kind of hatred. And when you look at them all together, it's like a wow. Like you said, when you're in Poland, it's like a wow. When you really stand back and look at it, we just take for granted, of course, everyone's going to hate us. There's a Harvard math professor by the name of Tom Lehrer in the 1960s who used to write very funny satirical songs. And he had a song called National Brotherhood Week, which is a week in America where supposedly everyone's supposed to get along for a week because America is the melting pot. It's just one giant mix of all different kinds of immigrant populations. And it has, a verse, the Catholics hate the Protestants, the Hindus hate the Muslims, and everyone hates the Jews. So groups hate each other, but one of the things that seems to unify the world, it's not that everyone in the world's an anti-Semite, but anti-Semitism is the most universal hatred in human history. Wherever we've gone, in any significant numbers, for any extended period of time, anti-Semitism is followed. It's not related to our relationship with one group of people, one country, one religion, one nationality, one racial group. So that's one aspect, the universality. The other thing is the intensity of it. That it's not just, the word anti-Semitism was coined, the phrase was coined by a German Jew hater by the name of Wilhelm Marr in 1879, someone who Hitler based much of his thinking on, in a book he wrote called The Victory of Germandom Over Judaism. This was when racial thinking was starting to appear after Darwinian evolution. And he wanted to make hatred of Jews sound more scientific and not so much a religious thing, and racial. So he coins this phrase anti-Semitism, which means prejudice or hostility towards Jews and Jews alone. And what's interesting about it is until today, it remains really like the only form of racial or religious intolerance that has its own word to describe it. And if you hate a Black person, you're a racist. You hate an Asian, you're a racist. You hate a Christian, there's no word for it, but only Jew hate has to have its own word to describe it. But the second aspect that sets it apart is, it's not just prejudice or hostility. If the worst thing we Jews had to suffer through was, some people making jokes about us and some low-level discrimination, not being able to get into a few country clubs or hospitals, universities, which was what anti-Semitism was in places like America before the Holocaust, that wouldn't be so bad. But we see that it's the most intense hatred in human history. It's one unendingly long list of persecution, expulsion, physical and economic marginalization, ghettoization, rape, pillage, beating, up to, trying to wipe us out completely, genocide. And even that word, Ollie, is very interesting. It was created by a Polish Jewish refugee, Dr. Raphael Lemkin, in 1944, who was the father of the idea of crimes against humanity in international law. He flees from Poland during the war. He says, there's a crime happening in Europe. There's no word to describe. And he creates this word, genocide. So we have the universality of it, the intensity of it. The third thing that sets it apart is the longevity. It's the oldest recorded hatred in human history. I know when Thames Television in England did a series on anti-Semitism many decades ago, it was entitled Anti-Semitism, the Longest Hatred, because it's the longest continuous recorded hatred in human history. And the last thing that sets it apart is the irrationality of it. That, we're accused of anything and everything. We kidnap Christian babies, use their blood to bake matzah. We poison wells. We're in league with the devil. We control the world's economy, seismic activities, solar flares. We trigger tsunamis in Southeast Asia to drown Indonesia with tidal waves, release sharks into the Red Sea to destroy Egyptian tourism, send vultures to spy on Saudi Arabia. Like 2 years ago, Iran accused us of stealing their cloud cover. I always jokingly say, we laugh at it, but it's not funny. It's crazy. But I always say, if people believed even 10% of what they say about us, no one would mess with us. Would you mess with people who control the weather, the animal kingdom, the governments, banks? They basically run the world. But it's Professor Michael Curtis, actually, who's also a British professor. We're working at Rutgers. He had a great line. He said, anything and everything is a reason to hate the Jew. Whatever you hate the Jew is that. And so you put it together, universality, intensity, longevity, irrationality. You have a hatred that is unlike any other hatred on the planet Earth. And that's what really sets it apart.
And so then the next question becomes how historians have tried to explain this. And a bunch of theories have been proposed throughout times that historians have analysed Jewish history. Can you explain those theories and why you think none of them really stack up?
Well, there's really not, some people try and take the normal approach that we're just like the ethnic minority, and there's some level of truth to these things. We've always, in many places like medieval Europe, we were the only other. It hasn't been really safe for Jews. I always say for Jews, if you should live in Israel, but if you're going to live in diaspora, you want to live in a multi-ethnic, multi-racial, multi-religious country, because then there's many groups of people. When we were like in Christian Europe 1,000 years ago, the only other group, we're going to always naturally be the target, because the basic reason for all hatred is dislike of the different. When we Jews generally chose to look, dress, act, and live differently. We had a different day of worship, we had different appearance, different kosher food, you name it. We separating ourselves out, and that would engender a certain level of hostility. So people often like to explain it using that term. The problem is even when we become just like the non-Jews, normally if you become like the majority culture, you eventually merge, you assimilate, and you disappear. The irony, one of the other really interesting, unique aspects of anti-Semitism is the greatest explosions of anti-Semitism have often taken place in places where we're most like the non-Jews, not most different from them. Like in Germany, no one was more German than German Jews. And then along comes Hitler and says the most dangerous kind of Jew is the Jews trying to mix with us. He's going to pollute our blood. So it's like checkmate. It's also supernatural. But those kind of standard classical explanations don't really work when you rigorously look at them and run them through the lab of human history. And people often explain, like the ones I hear is like, it's just, it's a sickness. It's just irrational. The problem with that is, you can't claim all of humanity is mentally ill. it's irrational. Okay, so Jews have spent a long time in history apologizing and trying to explain that we're not so bad. But no matter what we do, it doesn't go away. And none of the classical explanations that would normally explain racial or religious intolerance, when you really rigorously look at them and run them through Jewish history and human history, they don't really answer it. And a lot of people just throw up their hands and say, anti-Semitism. Well, no, we just got to try and get the world to get along and love us and realize we don't do horrible things. The problem with that is that's not an answer. It's like a doctor, a guy who's sick and he has a chronic illness and they keep running tests on him and they can't figure out what's wrong. It's like saying, take aspirin, at least you won't have a headache, but you're still sick. It doesn't get rid of the problem and it's not really an answer. So we're kind of left dangling with what's really causing anti-Semitism.
Right. And I know when you've spoken about this and had a bit more time and to delve into it, you've just to give our audience some examples of those classical theories, like one that Jews have more economic power, but then, what about Jews who are living in Eastern Europe or who had no political power and were poor, or like Jews killed Jesus, but, the New Testament doesn't even necessarily hold them accountable. And what about hatred from non-Christians, etc., and so on. But then the question becomes, okay, so what is the reason? What theory would you like to posit is something that can explain it? And also, just before you answer that, could it not be possible that each reason given for hating the Jews was just unique to each circumstance? So in the case of when Jews do well in society, it is down to just envy or whatever. And when in the case of Jews killing, having the claim that they had some role in the killing of Jesus, that's what was going on in that case, etc., etc. Is that in any way viable?
Yeah. So, well, you started out by pointing out an interesting thing, that we are accused of things that are, it's an endless list. We're capitalist, communist, warlike, passive, different, the same, strong, weak, rich, poor, dominant, lazy, servile, aggressive. First of all, you could say, okay, so in this case, they were rich. In this case, they were poor. The problem is you don't see that anywhere else. No matter what circumstance we're in, we can't escape it. So clearly it can't be that. You have to always point to one thing. When you look at why one group hates another, like you look at why like some white supremacists in America don't like Black people, they will always focus on 3 or 4 things about Black people that they're going to hyper focus on. Obviously, they're based on lies, misrepresentations of truth, but they're always going to focus on that. What's unique about it is it can't be all of these things, because too many excuses means there's no cause. So while there might be elements of truth to it, we find like Jews today are mostly assimilated, but very disproportionately involved in let's say, media and Hollywood and the movie business and things like that's true. But these are people who are completely disconnected from Judaism and are not using. If you saw that Jews were working in some sort of concerted way to push some sort of agenda on the world, maybe you could say that. But these Jews who are most influential in the world are generally Jews who are pushing agendas that have nothing to do with Judaism. They're just driven people who are successful, and they're not working in consort, to like somehow take over the world. But the point is, Ollie, if you look at any of these objectively, you see there's no basis to them. No matter what state we're in, they always come after us. Whatever, any shape we change ourselves into, the excuse just changes and says, oh, now you're like that, I'll hate you because of that. And anyone logically looking at it would realize that's really not the cause. So like you asked, we have to go a little deeper. And Judaism has an understanding of what drives anti-Semitism itself, which we understand has to do very much with the Jewish people. Because one of the most interesting aspects of supposed the reasons for hating Jews is very few of them have to do with Judaism. There's very little Jewish about hating Jews. Capitalist, communist, warlike, passive, different, the same, strong, weak, those are not Jewish traits. What Judaism would say is really, when you push all of the excuses aside, bottom line, what ultimately drives it, even subliminally in the collective consciousness of humanity, are much deeper things that have to do with who we are as a people and what we're supposed to accomplish in this world. And so to understand that, you have to understand what our mission has been in history, which in itself is a great discussion. But bottom line is, the uniqueness of the Jewish people, beginning with Abraham, is that in a world that is remarkably amoral and very brutal and callous thousands of years ago, and was completely polytheistic with everyone believing in multiple gods. Along comes this one man, Abraham, who radical transformative super genius, thinking outside the box, is able to connect to a completely counterintuitive idea of an infinite invisible being, God, this one God. Everything else is an illusion and not really there. And a being that gives humanity one absolute standard of morality. That, and that is, I think Dennis Prager may have coined the phrase ethical monotheism. The notion of one God who gives one standard of morality that is not subject to what the majority wants, what is expedient, what is the ancient world was a brutal, brutal place. Infanticide, killing of newborn babies for population control and sex selection was universal. Blood sport, inequality, injustice. These were aspects of even the most technologically, culturally sophisticated civilizations of the ancient world. Because we think there's a connection between culture and technology and law and order and morality. There's no connection in human history. Some of the most technologically, culturally, and law and order societies in human history have been the most brutal, whether it's ancient Rome or Nazi Germany. The really transformative idea the Jews brought into the world is that all the illusions aside, all the nonsense of polytheism aside, there's one infinite being who gives one standard of morality to all of humanity. And that's absolute. You can't mess with that. And what we've been doing since the time of Abraham has been dragging the world, kicking and screaming, towards that vision of morality and one God, and trying to connect humanity to God. That's really the Jewish people's job, the God Squad, as I call ourselves. And anti-Semitism, regardless of what excuse it hides behind, and a lot of the people, the masses believe these excuses, by the way. That does, just because they're not true doesn't mean people don't believe them. Like I said, all stereotypes about groups of people or individuals. But like a doctor who's trying to really diagnose, you can be distracted by the symptoms, like the sores on the skin, but the real disease is inside. Everyone's been mistreating and misdirecting. So, but when we clear all that aside, this is the driving cause. The way I would say it is we've been dragging humanity, kicking and screaming towards a vision of values and creating a world based on relationship with this one God. And anti-Semitism, regardless of whatever excuse it hides behind, on its deepest level, is always a rebellion against the national historic mission of the Jewish people. Even someone like Hitler sees it beautifully. Hitler has some amazing quotes. He's, I know it's weird quoting Hitler about Jews, but sometimes the people that hate us the most understand us the best. That makes sense because they understand what the real Jewish threat is. And Hitler says that the Jews put two scars on humanity, conscience on the soul and circumcision on the body, and both are inventions of the Jew. And that is one of the greatest backhanded compliments ever given to the Jewish people. We gave humanity a conscience. And whenever evil has come into the world, because we would define evil as the antithesis of those God-given values, it's always going to target the source of those values, which is God, but you can't go attack God. So it's going to attack the people who are supposed to be representing these values to humanity, which explains why evil always has dictators and things almost always have their crosshairs on the Jewish people first. Hitler starts with the Jews, then he spreads everywhere else. And why evil nations like Iran and North Korea are always going to target the Jewish state. Evil targets Jews because even on a subliminal level, is a recognition that ultimately what this is really all about, even though a lot of Jews don't even get this and aren't representing the Jewish people, is that it is a rebellion against that national historic mission that we've had for 3,700 years.
Okay, so I want to ask two questions on what you just said. If that's the case, why do we sometimes see anti-Semitism come from people who do believe in one God, who do believe in moral accountability from God, even believe in maybe some of the key, if anti-Semitism ever came from people who practice the Muslim or Christian faith, they accept many of the premises of Judaism, that the Ten Commandments, etc. So, number one, how would you explain that? And number two, if that's what's really going on at a subconscious level, it's a rebellion against this sort of godly accountability and morality message. Why is there anti-Semitism against, let's say, Jews who are totally non-practicing but are in no ways really pushing the messages of Judaism?
Two excellent questions. And it just totally went out of my mind, the first one you asked me.
The first one was about people who do accept.
Right. Yeah, right, exactly. That's a great question, because you think, okay, I understand why the pagan world would be so anti-Jewish, because their worldview came from this pagan ideology, and it was basically decided by human beings, or a perception of what the gods who aren't even real wanted. But how do you explain Christians and Muslims? They believe in one God. There's a lot of similarities. I always, by the way, say when I'm explaining Christianity and Islam, which is sort of Maimonides, the great medieval Jewish rabbi, philosopher, scholar, doctor, he basically, I'm paraphrasing him, but he says it's basically 2 steps forward, 1 step backward. That the great impact of Christianity and Islam on humanity's collective conscience was basically eliminating amoral polytheism from much of the world and accepting the idea of one God, because any believing Christian or Muslim, there's one God, there's one standard of morality. He created the world. He gave the Jewish people the Torah at Mount Sinai, but then he changed his mind and chose us instead. So part of that resentment comes from, and hostility comes from, the notion of like a replacement theology idea. But it also comes from the fact that just accepting one God, it's easy to come off the tongue, but Judaism doesn't say you got to believe one God and one standard of morality. Judaism has a very complex system of laws, 613 commandments. It even gives to non-Jews a system of 7 commandments, which are actually more complicated than just 7, called Noahide laws, which is sort of like Judaism light. And unless those nations, even if they pay lip service to the idea of one God, buy into the practical application of that and the details of it, it's not only not going to necessarily make the world a better place, it's going to make it can even increase hostility towards us, because you have people paying lip service to one God, but not actually acting in that way. And not only that, viewing us or our continued existence as some sort of a contradiction or to their claims of that they replaced us in human history. So the 2 ideas kind of work in consort together to create a continued atmosphere where you actually have often more hostility coming from places like Christian medieval Europe. But you have to also appreciate, going a little deeper, Ollie, that it's precisely because they didn't translate the beliefs into practical practice that they didn't actually, it was like a veneer, like a coating on the outer layer of the skin of nice ideas, but beneath it, all the garbage is still there. It's like spraying air freshener in a garbage dump. It smells sort of nice, but the garbage is still there. What's interesting is when you look at, for instance, a great example is the evangelical Christian community that actually finally takes the Bible super seriously. They really do believe it's the word of God. When God says to God says to Abraham in Genesis, "I'll bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you." And you listen to, and I work a lot with evangelical Christians, they truly believe that God is going to judge them by how they treat us. And these are the first group of Christians that I can think of in history. There have been a few individuals throughout history for hundreds of years, but the first group as a group that not only acts, I would say in general, very morally, but also is extremely supportive of Jews and Israel, because they have aligned themselves much closer to, the Jewish worldview, this idea of that we are, God is the God of all humanity, but we have a unique role to play in the story. And our job is not to conquer, not to convert, but to be the role model to lead the world back to God. And this group of Christians specifically sees us in the proper light. And therefore, unlike earlier groups like medieval Europe, which was incredibly violent and nasty towards Jews, or radical Islam, these are groups that actually are extremely supportive and back us and don't try and denigrate us or deny that we have a role to play in the story. So that is definitely part of the explanation. And you asked me something else. What was the second?
Well, the second was that what about Jewish people who live in societies and they themselves have no interest in identifying with Judaism? Why would an anti-Semite be bothered by that if that's what's going on at a subconscious level?
Because I would say on most people's minds, subconsciously, Jews, they recognize there's something Jewish about Jews who are even disconnected Jewishly. When you look at these kind of Jews, as a Jew, I look at them and you see how Jewish they are. You look at a guy like a Bernie Sanders, for instance, who is a socialist, but he's so Jewish, a Woody Allen. These people may not be observant Jews. They may not know anything about Judaism, but Judaism would say that Jews have a unique kind of drive that we inherit from Grandpa Abraham and Grandma Sarah going back thousands of years ago. And there are certain traits. I have a whole presentation on this called Driven, where I talk just about how even Jews without the Torah software, as we say it, still manifest these Jewish traits: radically transformative thinking, incredible drive, and caring. And you can demonstrate this so clearly. So the true clear thinking hater of the Jew understands that these traits are innate in who Jews are, and therefore just going after, let's say, the religious Jews or the Torah or something like that is not enough. Hitler himself says, even if there'd never been a Jewish school or a synagogue with the Old Testament, the Jewish spirit would still exist and exert its influence. It has been there from the very beginning, and there is no Jew, not a single one, who does not personify it. And he goes on to call the Jews the Belzenhard, which is basilicus or bacteria, virus, which we now appreciate viruses. The whole world gets that one. If you let one Jew survive, even a disconnected Jew, with his unique Jewish soul personality, he'll be a super spreader. He's going to somehow create some offshoot movement that is based on Jewish worldview, that is antithetical to me, dictator, guy who wants to change the world, my worldview. And therefore, it's not enough to go after the rabbis and the synagogues and the day schools. Every single Jew has to be eliminated. And the real, true people who understand what Judaism is about in terms of the anti-Semites are the ones who are the most uncompromising coming after us, because they recognize this fact. And I know it sounds kind of weird and funky, but Hitler himself says it openly, and Judaism agrees with that. That's what's really interesting. I always say a guy like Hitler is not evil because of his understanding of the Jewish people. He understands Jews actually remarkably well. He's evil because of his reaction to the understanding. And that's what makes him evil. And to understand that, you can't look at Mein Kampf, which is a propaganda book for the masses. You have to look at like the books that are written about conversations Hitler has with people like Martin Bormann, his personal secretary, Hitler Speaks, Hitler's Table Talk, these kind of books. Then you get into his mind and you really see that he understands this point, that a Jew is a Jew is a Jew. Even if he's baptized 100 times, he gets really wet, but he's always Jewish, and he's always going to push that Jewish agenda on the world.
Yeah, it's I've often say to people that the Nazis took the Jews and Judaism very, very seriously. Adolf Eichmann, like going to learn Hebrew and all the rest of it, it was just about, they had a reaction to it. They just said, we hate this. It's not they didn't understand it. It's not it was a mad irrationality. It was just a deep, deep opposition to the Jewish people's mission.
Could you elaborate?
Sure.
I just add a comment to that. That's true, but on the highest level, the German propaganda, if you look at it, is not based on, Hitler doesn't get up and say the Jew represents morality maps. He says the Jew, he played up on the racial theory stuff, and Jews are inferior, and he played up on the Jewish control, and they triggered World War I, they destroyed Germany, they're trying to destroy the world, but very few people will openly direct this to the masses. It's way too sophisticated and profound an idea that you don't want to market to masses to galvanize hatred. So while he may have understood it, and his inner circle may have understood it, he's not branding anti-Semitism precisely in that language.
And was Hitler a believer in God? Was he religious? Was he a pagan? Is there a conclusive view on this?
First of all, Hitler, by the way, I have quotes of Hitler talking about how Islam would have been so much better suited. Hitler hated Christianity. He just didn't survive long enough to go after the church. I have multiple quotes of Hitler who met with the Mufti of Jerusalem, Hajj al-Mina Husseini, who's a big, they like each other very much, and talking about how Islam, with its idea of jihad and with its very physical idea of heaven, the 72 virgin thing, it's kind of like Valhalla, if you know Viking Teutonic stuff, which the Germans are really into, where after you die, you go to this big hall and you fight and you drink and you have a party your whole rest of your life. He said the Islamic idea of heaven fits much better with the German personality, and the idea of jihad, this aggressive conquest thing, would fit much better with the German personality. It's a scary thought. Jihadi German Nazis would have been really scary. He hated Christianity, hated it. And to answer, the best answer to your question is the words of the Hitler Youth Song, which every kid in Germany is singing from 1933 to 1945, excuse me. And I hold the last 7 words of that song are the 7 most important words to not only understand the Holocaust, but to understand really all of anti-Semitism. And the English translation of the song is, "We are the joyous Hitler youth. We don't need any Christian virtue. Our leader is our savior," meaning Hitler. "The Pope and Rabbi shall be gone. We want to be pagans once again." And Hitler viewed the Jews and the Jewish ideas as a human concept, which was not natural, which was going to destroy the world. Nature is brutal, but nature is balanced. the strong survive, the weak are lunch. That's how it works in the animal kingdom. That's how empires worked in the ancient world. There was no mercy. There was no respect for borders, but that kept the world strong. He said the Jew is actually destroying the world. And it's interesting, by the way, that evil people, unlike Hollywood likes to portray them as dark and black and evil and wanting to do damage, evil people are always very confident that they're trying to save the world.
But
yeah.
Sorry, go for it.
No, H.L. Mencken, who's an American writer, curmudgeon in the beginning of the 20th century, has a great line. He says, the urge to fix the world is almost always a false face to rule it. And that's really Hitler at his best.
Yeah. And wow, that's a very powerful quote. Was Hitler, though, I mean, I know he sometimes referenced God in some of his speeches, but do we know whether he was an atheist or a believer?
Well, he talks about providence a lot, like providence, a force. I don't, from what I know of Hitler, I would not say he seems to be openly, by his own admissions, basically a pagan. That he believed in a spiritual force, that he believed in destiny, that his role in history was to be the savior of humanity. But it doesn't seem to be, from what I know of Hitler, even if he may have paid lip service for the sake of expedience, because Germany was a Christian country. But all the things I've seen about him is in his heart, he was very clearly a real hardcore pagan in his worldview.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So the points he was saying about Islam weren't necessarily about Islam, theological beliefs. It was just a few particular things that he thought he could harness for his own political, ideological ends.
It was probably expedient, probably a lot to do with expedience. Again, I haven't done extensive research on his relationship to that, but he says if you're going to give some sort of monotheistic faith to the world, the Islamic one at least fits more close to his pagan worldview in terms of the world to come. And Hitler has there's a quote about Hitler saying that, the only thing he says the only thing that Christianity added to Judaism was turn the other cheek, and Christians are the last people to actually follow that. He viewed the idea of, like being passive and loving your enemy. These were antithetical to his worldview. He was a militarist and very belligerent, and the Christian idea of, love and, someone slaps you, give them the other cheek and they can slap that side. He hated that kind of stuff. Right. So I think probably I would say he would have he really liked, he loved Wagner. He loved the Teutonic stuff, the ancient German and Nordic legends. He loved the Roman Empire. Even if you look at all the images, the standards used by the Nazi army, the whole imaging is very classical Roman, pre-pagan, pre-monotheism, pre-Christianity. That's what his image was. Return the world to the great pagan empires of the ancient world. Expansionist, the strong survivor, we're going to conquer the world and have 1,000-year Reich. And all these monotheistic ideas are going to just stand in the way of that vision.
Now, how does this whole discussion about anti-Semitism feed into what's happening with Israel today, Zionism and anti-Zionism?
So, it's just, I always say that Israel bashing is the final form that anti-Semitism is taking in human history. Because, by the way, anti-Semitism always has a sort of silver lining in it. And insofar as I always say, even with the Holocaust, if there's any silver lining that came out of the Holocaust, because I know it sounds kind of harsh and cynical, but the world prefers us as victims, not victors. And there's a certain algorithm I got to work out about how many Jews are killed and suffer, how much sympathy we get from the world, which has a shelf life. So, you saw in the Intifada when, in 2000, 17 Jews killed and 150 wounded in a bombing in a pizzeria. So, for 10 days, Israel is allowed to defend itself. Then the world goes back to bashing it. 6 million Jews dying in the Holocaust created enough sympathy in the world to allow the world, the United Nations, to come together and vote November 29, 1947, 33-13 with 10 abstentions to partition Palestine. But that's kind of worn off. So it gave us the silver lining in that is it wore off. And the other thing, I know it sounds weird, but like the fact that anti-Semitism, the greatest explosions of anti-Semitism take place in places where Jews are most comfortable, which is counterintuitive and not normal, because the more like the majority, the less we should be hated. It's, in my mind, almost as if we're being told from up above, your role in history is way too important. You cannot be allowed to disappear, because if you disappear, the world's going to go back to darkness. So one way or another, if you're not going to willingly choose to do it, if you choose to opt out, sorry, when we hit a certain, threshold, boom, precisely from where we least expect it, we're going to get it because it has the side benefit. Look what's going on in Ukraine today. The way I view it is that God is basically shutting down the diaspora, country by country and continent by continent. We had the great wave of emigration from the Soviet Union with the collapse in 1989, and now we're finishing that process. Now Europe is closing down for Jews. The anti-Semitism is going up. So we see there's a process of boom, 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 boom. And the Israel bashing, even though it seems contradictory, if God wants the Jews to come back to the land of Israel, then why is he bashing Israel? People are going to be afraid to come because it's dangerous. It's just, the real message behind it is that it has nothing to do with Israel. And we always see huge spikes in anti-Semitism around the world. I remember in May of last year, when they had that short little Gaza war for a few days, you're from London, you had cars driving through Golders Green, the Jewish part of London, with people on loudspeakers, Muslims screaming, Arabs screaming, kill the Jews and rape their women. This is 2021 in London. So it's just so we can never get distracted by thinking it has anything to do with what Israel is doing. After a few minutes of yelling and screaming about Israel, it always morphs into open anti-Semitism. And even in Israel, the Palestinians, they don't talk about Israelis. It's always Yahud. It's always Jew, Jew, Jew. So what we might think, it has something to do with Israel's relationship with the Palestinians, and it's a separate thing and separate from anti-Semitism. I always say one of the few things that seems to unite the world today, even very opposite groups like radical Islam with the extreme left, which should have nothing in common with each other because their ideologies are so different. Yet the one thing, and I've even seen it again in England, I saw it on Manchester University campus probably like 15 years ago, where the student union got together and went after first the Zionist organizations, then tried to go after the Jewish societies. And it was, radical leftists and radical Muslims together on the one issue they can agree upon is they have very different ideologies, but the one thing that united them was they had a tremendous hostility towards Israel and the Jewish people on a certain level.
Yeah. So just lastly, before we finish, I want to quickly go back to that point you made earlier about the Jewish personality. In other words, regardless of whether one is practicing or not practicing, there are certain things that crop up again and again throughout Jewish history within the Jewish characteristics. And you said that goes back to Abraham and Sarah. Can you just elaborate a bit on what you mean by that, how that works, and how this is manifested throughout history?
Right. So again, the short version of that is, we have idea of physical genetics, which you can measure in a microscope, that, all original nations, today the world is a melting pot, like America, it's a mushmash, but the idea, and this is anthropologically true and also from the Jewish perspective, the original nations were large extended families that had biological connections going back to two people, had children, a small group of people became a large nation. Now it's all mixed up. But Judaism, because we're not a race because anyone can join, we have, and a lot of people have left the Jewish people and people have joined the Jewish people. Our origins are, even though we're scattered around the world in different places, we're a nation living still largely in exile, many of us in diaspora, but we have common origins. And Judaism says that there are certain traits, just as there's DNA and you can check mitochondria and Y chromosomal connection going back to the original people, so too Judaism says, it's an idea in Jewish thought, that the traits that Abraham and Sarah have are passed down to the Jewish people. Non-Jews can have these traits also, but Jews have them disproportionately. And those traits are, like Abraham, radically transformative thinker, to think outside the box when everyone's worshiping idols and connect to a counterintuitive, infinite, invisible being. That's radical. Like Jonathan Sachs wrote this great book, Radical Then, Radical Now. Jews are always disproportionately radical. To push radically transformative ideas on the world, to want truth regardless of consequences, you got to have a lot of drive, a lot of chutzpah, which is a very Jewish word, gumption, tenacity, spunk. So Jews are incredibly driven people. Non-Jews can be driven too, but Jews are disproportionately driven. And the last thing is Abraham's original idea of connecting people to God was through kindness, emulating the Almighty. The word in Hebrew is chesed. And we see Jews today are disproportionately focused on that. And again, non-Jews can be too, but to make a very long story short, you cannot look at this spiritual genetics in a microscope like you can look at your Y chromosome or your mitochondria, but statistically it stands out like a flashing red light. The fact that Jews are 0.2% of the world's population, but have 22% of all the Nobel Prizes since 1901, which is 11,500% more than we should have, 24% of the Fields Medals in mathematics, that kind of stuff. The fact that any cause shows that shows Jewish drive, over accomplishment, disproportionate over accomplishment. The fact that you take any cause to make the world a better place, speaking about caring, communism, any political ideology to try and top-down fix the world, communism, socialism, feminism, Black civil rights, anti-apartheid, Doctors Without Borders, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, even non-Jewish causes like the Salvation Army, founded by an Anglican minister named William Booth, whose mother was a Jew from Nottingham, England. Jews always trying to fix the world, social justice. And so you have the caring, the radically transformative, and Jews are always in the forefront of all transformative movements in human history. So, I ran through that very quickly.
And by the way, you find this, just because I don't want people to misconstrue this, on both sides of the political spectrum, you find revolutionary, whether it's, you mentioned some of the things happening like communism and socialism, but also some of the big, movements of conservatism, capitalism. Think about thinkers like Milton Friedman, the great capitalist thinker.
Schumacher, absolutely.
Right.
Yeah, it's not,
So we're not necessarily saying, these traits you're speaking of, radical chutzpah, radical transformation, caring about the world and changing it. They don't always necessarily manifest in a way that's positive or within Torah thought. But in other words, they're traits that can be used in positive ways, negative ways, but they're just neutral traits, really.
Yeah, 100%. They can be, when Jews can do great good and be disproportionately impactful. They can do great bad. The biggest financial scandals: Michael Milstein, Ivan Boesky, Bernie Madoff. You have organized crime, Meyer Lansky. Only Jews organize crime. Everyone else has disorganized crime. So it's a neutral thing. I always say Jews are like a rocket ship. A rocket ship is the most powerful machine on the planet, and it can be a force for great good, send a person to the moon, send a satellite into space, or it can launch an intercontinental ballistic, missile. And so that's the Jew. A rocket ship needs fuel, a guidance system, and a payload.
Isn't there a quote in the Talmud that says, without the Torah, the Jewish people could destroy the world?
The Talmud in Beitzah says, if Jews didn't have Torah, they destroy the world. Some of the most destructive ideas, communism. Marx was not a destructive person. He was a misguided Jew. His family converted to Christianity, but he still has that Jewish soul. It's a whole topic about why Jews are so into, in general, progressive political ideologies. There's a great discussion, by the way, and it very much has to do with the Jewish personality. But we are like a raw force in history. But without those Jewish values that come from Torah, which keep us Jewish. When Jews leave those behind, they assimilate after 3 to 5 generations. When Jews leave those behind, they don't know where to direct that drive. It's every ism they could think of, often isms that are antithetical to Judaism. I always say we have Jews for every ism but Judaism. And so it's in every way, it's our guidance system, it's our payload, it's our fuel. Jews with Judaism, it's a great combination. It keeps Jews Jewish, it keeps the drive under control and directed in the right direction. It makes the Jewish people incredibly transformative force in human history. And it's just a win-win combination. And Jews for Judaism make excellent role models who are doing it correctly for the human race. And God knows humanity needs some good role models today. And that's really going back to what we started out with. That is ultimately our job in this world, to be this light to nations, to live and act in a way that inspires people to want to connect the big guy upstairs, who's the God of all humanity.
So to finish, what's the cure for anti-Semitism?
Perfect. So Rav Chaim of Volozhin said it the best. He was a rabbi who lived in the beginning of the 19th century. Sometimes the shortest quotes are the best ones. He says, when Jews don't make Kiddush, Gentiles make Havdalah. And Kiddush is the ceremony we make on Friday night or on the Sabbath, that higher spiritual day we enter with a cup of wine. Havdalah is a ceremony we make at the end of the Sabbath when we go down to a lower level. Rav Chaim of Volozhin wasn't talking literally about making Kiddush on a cup of wine on Friday night. He was talking about the national historic mission of the Jewish people to do what's called Kiddush Hashem, to live and act in a way individually and collectively that inspires the world. If we, the Jewish people, don't fill the world with those values, there's a great principle of physics. Nature abhors a vacuum. Vacuums will be filled by something. If the vacuum of values is sitting there empty and we don't fill it with the values that come from the big guy upstairs, which are the most transformative ideas in human history, the ideas of value of life, peace, social responsibility, equal justice, this all comes from directly or indirectly from one God in Judaism to the world. If we don't fill the world with those values, the world's going to be full of the opposite values. Those opposite values are what we would call evil in an absolute sense. And when evil comes into the world, it will target us first. So we could spend a lot of money making Holocaust memorials and explaining to the world we don't do all of these things, and anti-defamation leagues and synagogue security. But until we treat the root cause, which is to proactively finish the mission that Abraham started 3,700 years ago, the world is not going to leave the Jewish people alone, is not going to leave the Jewish state alone. And I know it sounds like the impossible dream. Look at the anti-Semitism, the disunity in the world. But if you look at how much we've transformed the world directly and indirectly, I started out this whole thing by quoting Ben Gurion: a Jew who doesn't believe in miracles is not a realist. And we have so transformed the world. And the fact that you and I are having this conversation in the year 2022 and still around in the world as Jews is living proof of the supernatural. So you got to have the big picture, and then you see that anything is possible. The mission is great, but it definitely can be accomplished if we have some Jewish unity and some Jewish proactivity. And that's what we really, really need.
Rabbi Ken Spiro, thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
My pleasure.